Ladies and gentlemen, I am not an economist, so I do not feel very competent in the area. What I want to do is to reflect on the momentous changes in ethics that rendered modern capitalism possible. So what I am interested in are the relations between the concept formation in ethical theory in the 18th century and the creation of modern capitalism. About the real causes, the immediate causes of the financial crisis that we have witnessed in the last years, such as private overspending, speculative bubble in the real estate market, insufficient capital requirements for banks, oligopolies in the banking sector, uncontrolled capital flows between nations, limited liability of managers, risky behavior due to bonuses that were based on short-term profits instead of long-term advantages for the institution. Other people are far more competent to speak than I, as a philosopher, could be. But it is very important to understand that capitalism is not simply a way of producing things, but that is based on certain moral ideas. And one can also not understand the aversion against capitalism if one does not see that it's often based on a misunderstanding of the logic of capitalism, sometimes on unveiling of certain features of capitalism. Marxism, for example, owes its success not so much to its economic analysis. When the second and the third volume of the Capital came out, the theory was already superseded by the development of the neoclassical value theory, but by the tone of moral indignation with which Marx accompanied the radical ethical and moral changes that occurred in the system of his time. Now, the interesting thing is that if we look at the moral arguments which we try to master the ethical situation, most of his arguments were already developed in the 18th century. And therefore, the authors on whom I will focus are mainly authors of the 18th century. It was myself a surprise to see how much of the central ideas can be found in this time. The author on whom I will specifically focus, and then on the reaction by David Hume and Adam Smith to him, is Bernard de Mandeville, who was a Dutch doctor who, after his study of medicine in Rotterdam, emigrated to the United Kingdom and became one of the leading intellectuals in the first half of the 18th century. Mandeville is part of a group of thinkers that I like to call the Three Terrible Mass, because through fortuitous result, the names begin all with M.A., therefore I call them the Three Mass. And the other two are, of course, Machiavelli and Malthus. What is common to these authors who live in very different times, come from different cultures? Machiavelli is Italian, Mandeville Dutch, and Malthus English. Common to them is the insight, which in this form is a novel insight that you do not find in ancient and medieval ethics, that unfortunately ethics is more complex than it has seemed till now, because we have the duty to look at unintended consequences of actions. Traditional virtue ethics looked at the intrinsic value of certain virtuous behavior and justified human behavior as an emanation from the virtue. And the disquieting insight that we find in authors like Machiavelli, Mandeville, and Malthus is that sometimes there are persons who are very good-hearted but contribute to objective disaster, and there are persons whose motives are quite repellent but still contribute to good outcomes for society as a whole. That is the new insight that appears in the 16th century for the first time, connected with the state formation. You all know the arguments of Machiavelli that there may be very benign princes who are not able to maintain order in the state, and these people will lead to civil war, while tough guys who pacify an area may be quite disagreeable as human beings, but may do something much better for their state. And this insight is not only an insight that we find in Machiavelli, but we find, for example, also expressed in incredible form in Shakespeare's works. In Henry VI, we have a very, very noble and pious king, Henry VI, who is absolutely unable to hold the country together, which slides into civil war, while his father, Henry V, is a far more ambiguous character with regard to his motives, but is able to win the battle of Agincourt and pacify England internally. And another great work of the time that starts with expressing this insight is certainly the Don Quixote by Cervantes. Don Quixote at the beginning seems to be simply a very good person who only wreaks havoc on his environment by his well-intended actions that simply are not based on an appropriate understanding of how the contemporary reality works. He doesn't understand, for example, that even erring knights have to pay bills in hotels. This is not compatible with the ethos in which he has been brought up, and modern capitalist, early capitalist entrepreneurs are not too happy with this understanding of his moral code, and this creates a lot of problems. Well, Mandeville is, for various reasons, a fascinating actor, a fascinating author, and his interpretation has been controversial in the history of ideas because he again and again pretends to be a pious Jansenist. And since he studied in Rotterdam, it is possible that he studied with Pierre Bayle, and as you probably know, Pierre Bayle is this great, great Calvinist author, in whose interpretation there is no agreement. Some people say he was a devout Calvinist, and other people know this is a screen for bringing forth another agenda. Very great historians of philosophy do not agree on this issue. In the case of Mandeville, I think that it is quite obvious that he uses his moral rigorism as a screen for another agenda. I don't think he's a sincere a Christian at all, but certainly he describes an enormous phenomenon of early modernity, namely that the value system that modern society is bringing forth is in contradiction, in strident contradiction with the virtues recommended by the gospel. Let me give you a passage from Jonathan Swift, who at the beginning of the 18th century writes about the actual situation. He writes in his famous satire, "An argument to prove that the abolishing of Christianity in England may, as things now stand, be attended with some inconveniences and perhaps not produce those many good effects proposed thereby." There he writes, even if of course Swift was a dean in Dublin and a defender of Anglicanism, "To offer at the restoring of the real Christianity would indeed be a wild project. It would be to break the entire frame and constitution of things, to ruin trade, extinguish arts and science, with the professors of them, in short, to turn our courts, exchanges, and shops into deserts." And Mandeville begins with this line, but now makes a turn. He says, yes, it is true that the world in which we are living, moved by consumerism, by the desire for luxury goods, which in this form is some novel phenomenon which drives modern economy, is something that will have positive consequences. And in fact, he published these 200 doggerel couplets in 1705 with the title "The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest," which then later was reshaped and went through many, many editions. And the final title is "The Fable of the Beast, or Private Vices, Public Benefits." The book was a big scandal. It was indicted by a grand jury in Middlesex. In France, it was ordered to be burned by the hangman. And in the polemics against Mandeville, he was often called Man-Devil, as a counterfigure to man-God Christ. His central idea is, first of all, a valid contribution to the history of economics. Mandeville understands that mercantilism cannot work, that the idea that you have to hoard money inside your country, that you should only try to export but not to import, is an implausible economic theory, and he has great merits in the breakdown of a mercantilist doctrine and the preparing of free trade doctrine. But his central idea is that only the unleashing of the desire for luxury goods will, in the whole, bring mass poverty to an end. Only by allowing people to try to strive for goods that are intrinsically not very respectable, we have a chance to overcome poverty. And he recognizes that the motives that drive people are often selfish. He even thinks that in the manifestation of traditional virtues, there's also often selfishness, ostentatiousness, etc. But his central idea is that we have to live with that, because out of this new modern vices, economic benefits will turn out, and that a society which would deny economic growth to itself in the name of certain moral ideals would at the same time be overruled by neighboring countries. He understands very well that the strategy to opt out from modern capitalism is not evolutionarily stable, as we would say today. At the same time, Mandeville recognizes that the market cannot function completely based on egoism. Even if his ethics is fundamentally cynic and egoistic, he recognizes that the market presupposes that, for example, the politicians who regulate the markets are not up for sale themselves. In the moment in which they become corruption, he calls corruption a terrible thing that would destroy the functioning of the markets. But at the same time, he writes, unhappy is the people, and the constitution will be ever precarious, whose welfare must depend upon the virtues and consciences of ministers and politicians. So he hopes that there will be an institutional arrangement that doesn't need to appeal to traditional virtues. And in his own analysis of the development of morality, he thinks that morality, in the sense anticipating Nietzsche, is nothing that says moral virtues are a political offspring which flattery begot upon pride. The weak flatter the persons who are stronger by appealing to their moral sense. Now, the important insights of our authors, Machiavelli, Mandeville, and Malthus, is that the moral evaluation has become more complex, because even if we understand that certain intrinsically virtuous behavior have negative consequences and intrinsically vicious behavior has positive consequences, they do not offer us a clear algorithm to compensate for the positive and negative sides of the other. There is no such clear algorithm which allows us to say what is good. However, they are, after all, optimistic thinkers, because fundamentally they believe that we don't have to appeal anymore to great virtues. We can use the vices that are there if we channel them rightly and bring these to acceptable results. So in a certain sense, there is a relief. We don't need virtues in the same degree as traditional societies have meant, because if we are able to order these vices, we will come to acceptable results for all. And since the 18th century, particularly in David Hume, is very skeptical with regard to the capacity of practical reason to master passions. The model is that you would have countervailing passions. You must put passions against passions in order to achieve an optimal result. And the most important transformation is then the transition in the 18th century from the concept of passion to the concept of interest. Albert Hirschman, the great historian of economy, has worked a lot on this. Interests are more prudent. They anticipate negative consequences for oneself and can therefore better be dealt with. What are the reactions of the main philosophers to Mandeville in the 18th century? As I told you, he was published very often, translated into many languages. I want to focus only on the arguments of David Hume and Adam Smith. David Hume publishes in 1752 an essay of luxury, which was then published with the title of The Refinement of the Arts, in which he discusses the question whether the development of luxury goods is something which is morally acceptable or not. And his argument is first that gratification of a sense is not in itself a vice. So he tries to reject a traditional austere criticism, but then this is only a negative statement, it's not a vice, it doesn't say that it's good. He insists that out of modern search for luxury goods, a lot of positive things will come. People will overcome their indolence because they will be motivated to work harder. This will stimulate also the liberal arts. If the if trade and the luxury goods are produced more, there are spillovers like the Lumen Christi Institute that are possible thanks to economic surplus and so on. And he also thinks that the development of modern capitalism will strengthen the middle class and therefore lead to stable liberal institutions. He rightly thinks that where you have a great mass poverty, liberty cannot be institutionalized for a long time. An argument that you don't find in him, but it plays an enormous role in the 18th century discussions on capitalism, for example, in Montesquieu and Kant, is that also the trade between the nations, du commerce, will render wars more and more outdated because they are not in the economic interest. And in fact, the theory that capitalism as such leads to wars is not a very plausible theory. When the First World War broke out, of course, the stock market went down. Usually wars are not in an interest. There are some sectors of the economy that may benefit, coffin makers or whatever, but it's certainly not so that wars as such are in an economic interest. So this is the strategy. But at the same time, Hume, who, even if not a Christian, is a serious moral thinker, rejects completely the idea of Mandeville that only the vicious can achieve good results. This is an idea that he finds repellent. He says, no, in principle, it is possible that you work hard, not because you want to have luxury goods, but because you want to help the poor, or because you want to give your children a good education, or you want to help meritorious friends. So the central idea of him is the idea that vices are a necessary condition for achieving positive consequences is unacceptable. However, he insists on the fact that as humans are, it may well be that two vices are better than one vice. So if you are indolent and desiring for luxury goods, these are two vices, it may be better than if you're only indolent, because at least this will produce something. But even if this is true, he says, we should never be committed to the idea that one vice itself is acceptable. And similar is the criticism of Hume's pupil Adam Smith, who after all was a professor of moral ethics and wrote The Theory of the Moral Sentiments before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is based on a Mandevillian idea. I mean, the term of invisible hand doesn't come from Mandeville, but Mandeville has very similar ideas, and in fact, Hayek has argued that Mandeville and Smith are the discoverers of the concept of the invisible hand, namely the fact that there is a system, a social system, that is based on unintended consequences. And for me, one of the very interesting questions, working also on the question of the development of the various sciences, is why was economy as a science fundamentally only developed in the 18th century by Adam Smith, while physics was developed by Newton in the 17th century? The mathematics of Newton is much, much more complex than that of Adam Smith. You need calculus in order to write the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. Why is economics younger than physics, even if it's mathematically simpler, at least in the version of Adam Smith? Well, the reason is very simple, because to understand that there is an area which is made up of unintended consequences was a profound ontological discovery that occurs fundamentally only in the 18th century. A discovery that could be linked to a theistic interpretation of the world. For example, in Giambattista Vico, we find similar arguments with regard to the justification of capitalism, and this is interpreted as a sign of divine providence. And now, Smith's main argument is that Mandeville's whole concept formation is absurd when he insists that vices are something that lead to negative consequences, that lead to positive consequences. He doesn't use the term vice plausible, because something which leads to positive consequences should not be called vice. On the other hand, Mandeville could say, but this positive consequences are unintended. Then probably Smith would try to argue, but even if they're unintended, for example, the politicians that allow this mentality to thrive want to have a positive consequences. But in any case, Adam Smith says that in Mandeville, vice was allowed to appear with more effrontery than ever, because of the fundamentally egoistic ethics that he develops. And I think that an explosion of such moral effrontery we have witnessed in the last decade. Now, if we try to understand from our contemporary point of view the basic moral questions at stake when we try to evaluate a system like capitalism, we have to start from this insight gained only in the 18th century, that there is a sphere of unintended consequences that we have to study. And as Professor Murphy was saying yesterday, it is true that often well-intended policies that do not understand the logic of a social system are doomed to fail. Thomas Sargent and Neil Wallis' policy ineffectiveness proposition is very well known. One of the reasons why Keynesianism did not work anymore is that people understood how Keynesianism worked. That's a big difference between laws in the social sciences and laws in the natural sciences. Once you understand the law of gravitation, you don't change the behavior of gravitating bodies. But once you understand that, for example, the government thinks that it will pay back the debt that it incurs now by accepting inflation, of course, the trade unions will ask for higher wages because they anticipate the inflation that the state has to incur later, to accept later in order to pay back its debts, and this will lead to both stagnation and inflation, to the phenomenon of stagnation that we found in the 1970s. So Keynes' theories worked very well in the 1930s and 40s, but the reason why they didn't continue to work as well was that people had understood how they worked. And this differentiates the social sciences radically from the natural sciences. Now, what are the merits of capitalism? The first is, this was also very well said yesterday, of course, that capitalism has unleashed productivity in a way that has not been achieved by any other economic system before. It has certainly reduced absolute poverty, not necessarily relative poverty. One can be quite skeptical with regard to the possibility of its reduction. You know, all Wilfredo Pareto's famous 80-20 theory. He tried to show that the relative poverty has remained relatively constant over the centuries. Not everybody agrees with his analysis, but certainly relative poverty is a morally less serious problem. Once you are beyond the subsistence level, differences may be acceptable. But even more important than the change in productivity is, of course, the moral idea of capitalism that you have to deserve what you get. Therefore, capitalism, the other two factors that contribute to the allocation of resources among humans, luck and inheritance, become morally more problematic. We think that it is not fair if someone inherits a lot of money without working for it. But if you earn money by satisfying the needs of other persons, so the story goes, then it is fair that you own this. And certainly another enormous advantage of a capitalist economy, in general of a market economy, there are pre-capitalist market economies with regard to centrally administered economies, is the fact that the consumer, through his decision what he buys, can have an impact on the production, which in planned economy is denied to him. Still, there are three grievous limits of capitalism, and I think they are at the basis of the increasing unease that we have. The first is a completely moral aspect. If we assume that capitalism achieves an equilibrium between self-interest and satisfaction of other needs, you can only become rich if you satisfy the needs of other persons, it is still so that we ask ourselves, but what are the motives of a person? Now, the person who tries to become rich may be motivated by greed or by the desire to satisfy needs of other people, and then interpret the remuneration as a just expression of what he has achieved. And of course, we cannot see in humans' hearts usually, and there is no reason to slander people without knowing them, but I think it is quite good that in fact there is no complete harmony between egoism and satisfaction of other needs. Why there is no complete harmony? Because the equilibrium between supply and demand in the market, of course, holds only for those with purchasing power. And there are a lot of people without purchasing power, the most miserable persons on the planet, but persons who are handicapped, persons, for example, who are no longer able to work, etc. And therefore, the satisfaction of these needs remains an important task that goes beyond the logic of capitalism, and we have to be grateful for that. And those entrepreneurs who, for example, fund meritorious charities, intellectual institutions, etc., show that indeed greed was not their main motive. There's this famous book by Carnegie, The Gospel of Wealth, which which insists that the moral entrepreneur has to invest his profits into morally acceptable reasons. He writes, "This then is held to be the duty of a man of wealth, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display or extravagance, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer and strictly bound as a matter of duty to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results to the community." The second problem of capitalism is that even if we assume that the person who has achieved in a legal way wealth has satisfied the needs of other people, we have to recognize that not all needs are equally important. And the whole, how shall I say, success and smoothness of capitalism is based on the fact that we do not judge anymore between the needs. Whatever needs you satisfy is regarded as equally meritorious. And this is an idea that is certainly open to doubt. We can say that the mark of vulgarity consists in no longer being distinguishing with the value and the price of something. The price is a function of the preferences of other people, but these preferences may be wrong. And therefore, if you become rich by satisfying some silly needs, I'm not necessarily sure that this as such earns more respect than concentrating on the needs of poor, for example. And clearly it is also so that the satisfaction of needs that are harming the person that indulges in them, like drugs, tobacco, is a morally very dubious activity. And even more, of course, if the capitalist system proves unable to prevent the externalization of costs. The externalization of costs is that you simply pass on the costs of certain products to other people who cannot push them back. And there are a lot of aspects that go into that direction. You may, for example, then export hazardous waste to poor countries that have almost no choice than to accept them. And of course, you can pass on external costs to future generations. Future generations are the great losers in the institutions of modernity because they have neither purchasing power nor suffrage. So neither the market nor the democracy has place for them. And capitalism and also the modern parliamentary democracy have proven unable to address this issue of the rights and needs of future generations. Finally, and now I really come to my end, the last problematic feature of capitalism is something which we understand already in Mandeville. Even if Mandeville is right that trying to create equilibrium of rational egoists can lead to desirable outcomes, and that we are not advised to try to eliminate such an equilibrium, Mandeville himself recognizes that the guardian of the market, not a term that he uses, but I think is very useful, the state cannot be based on the logic of rational egoism. It is clear that in the moment in which you have to fear that when you have worked for someone and he refuses to pay your a just wage and you go to a court, the judge will judge according to the interest, according to his own interest, namely if he gets more money from the person who refuses to pay your wage, all trust would collapse. The transaction costs would become horrendous. And crude corruption in this form does not exist in our Western democracies, or in few of them. What exists is something far more complex, shameless lobbying, that you try to have institutional frames corroded by promising goodies to those who act in this interest. And the collapse of the idea that the statesman has a responsibility towards the common good that is irreducible to his own interests is certainly something which endangers the guardian of the market and thus capitalism itself. Let me end with an anecdote which I like. I don't think that Coolidge was a great president, but there is one anecdote that I really love about him. Once at a big party at the White House, he was regarded as a person who was very reticent. A woman came to him and said, "Mr. President, I bet a lot of money that I would get more than 2 words out of you today." And he looked at her and said, "You lose." Regaining some of his attitude in the public sphere with regard to the effrontery of lobbyism, I think, remains one of the main tasks. Max Weber very rightly understood that the miracle of modern capitalism could only develop because a new structure of trust developed. The idea of capitalism is that you put your savings not into your stockings, you do not simply, when you have surplus, spend it out, inviting your friends or buying goods, but that you bring them to banks. And this can only work if there is a certain trust. And Max Weber, when he came to this great country, observed, for example, that in American Protestant churches, people were, after service, engaging in loans. The fact that people were visiting the same community was a sign that these are reliable people. And in the moment in which, for example, the trust in our financial institutions evaporates, because we have the impression that our financial institutions, in fact, do not really administer our savings in a responsible way, but give great bonuses to the CEOs, and when the money evaporates, capitalism will not survive. And so I do think that indeed the moral presuppositions of capitalism are not simply an academic issue, but are a crucial question for this century. Thank you for your attention.